Hello, I'm back again and I'm reading chapter 9 of Princess Alice's Memoirs, The Duchess of Gloucester. This is chapter 9 and this takes place in around 1935, and this is when she comes back from safari in Africa dealing with lions, facing lions, and she had quite an adventure in Africa, which was very interesting, and I had to break that up into three different videos, and that was quite an experience. And I think that really was a good experience for her to have before she goes into the royal family. And here I'm going to that right there is a picture of Prince Henry, the Duke of Gloucester. And this really is a good chapter. It's when she meets Prince Henry, and her brother was friends with him, her brother Billy, which I think might be the name that her son William, who was Prince William, the other Prince William, was named after. And so I think that's where that name comes from. And I think consequently, because William of Gloucester, Prince William, was in relatively close age to Prince Charles, Prince Anne and Prince Charles, and the Gloucesters were William and Richard were the older of the cousins, and then Anne and Charles were the younger of the cousins. They spent time together, and could be that Charles chose that name, for our current Prince Williams. Anyways, that's where that goes, and I will start with chapter 9. Almost as soon as I got back, I went to stay with the Athlons for Ascot, though nothing was said about it to me, of course. The idea was undoubtedly to put me in contact with Prince Henry again. Princess Alice probably knew Prince Henry was hoping to marry me. She was very fond of him and a good friend, and she was fond of me too, having got to know me in South Africa, so I met him there. And after that, it was only a matter of 3 months till we announced our engagement. I had an instinct that one day we would marry, and perhaps without ever really admitting it much to myself. I went to Kenya for the last taste of freedom before abandoning a truly private life forever. It was fairly obvious what his feelings were. He did not shower me with flowers because he did not do that sort of thing. But every time I saw him, I realized more clearly what he wanted. He was terribly shy, though I am afraid I made it no easier for him pretending not to notice. I was busy meeting old friends and organizing my second exhibition at the Walker Galleries. But after a while, we got in the habit of going for walks together in Richmond Park. He used to exercise his dogs there and felt away from prying eyes. Then one day, about breakfast time, the telephone rang at 2 Grosvenor Place. Luckily, my brother answered, and it was the press. "What's this we hear about Lady Alice and Prince Henry?" they asked. "First I've heard of it," said Billy, pretending to be the footman. And this shook them off for a while. So I'm going to show you where he used to So this is Richmond Park. It's really beautiful. This is where Prince Henry would walk his dogs, and this area here is where he proposed. I mean, if you can see how pretty it is, probably was so much nicer back then. But Here is it looks like it's outside London, but so you could imagine um that I believe is where they, were strolling. He'd walk his dogs and he proposed to Alice here. Towards the end of the summer, Prince Henry was posted to Catterick with his regiment, and I soon joined him in the north for a weekend party given by our old friends Teddy for the opening of the grouse season. That was when we became engaged. There were no formal declaration on his part. I think he just muttered it was an inside, it as an aside during one of our walks. Nor was there any doubt about my acceptance. I was 34, so I had a very good innings. Apart from my great happiness in getting married, I felt too that it was time I did something more useful with my life. After this, my sister Mary arranged for me to stay with some great friends of hers, Lord and Lady Barnard, who lived at Raby Castle, in an easy distance from Catterick. Mary said I had a great friend at the camp whom I should like to ask for dinner, so this too was fixed. But when I arrived, Lord Barnard apologized, saying I would have to entertain my young friend alone, because he had to go out to attend a Boy Scout camp, and Lady Barnard was away acting as a hostess for her relative, Lord Middleton, who was entertaining Queen Mary. I wonder if that he's related to the Middleton family. So, anyways, he was mortified when he returned soon after dinner and found that my young friend was Prince Henry. Meanwhile, Lady Barnard had mentioned to Queen Mary that I was staying at Raby, which gave her a hint that something was in the wind. Over the next few days, we had a lovely time together, motoring around the neighborhood, visiting the local antique shops to see if there was any furniture that might come in useful, and eating in sleepy country inns. The engagement was not yet announced, and though people must have recognized him, nobody rang the press or disturbed us in any way. The next problem was how to break the news to my father. He was ill by then that we were worried about the effect that the news might have on him. But when I finally did tell him, he said he had guessed the whole thing for some time and seemed much calmer than I was. He asked me if I was quite sure I felt equal to the task, because he knew how much I enjoyed my independence. If I married Prince Henry, I would have to accept that I was a servant of the country. Yes, see, isn't that something? And here, right here, is a picture of her. And this is Lady Alice. And this photograph was taken by one of the famous royal photographers at the time. This is a picture of in 1935. So, and that was Lady Alice. I bring that picture up. Here's one. So that's a picture of her young lady Alice. It's 1935. And, here's a picture of the wedding right here. That's a picture of the wedding. Right there is a wedding. But I'll continue reading. So, they married on the November 6, 1935, on the balcony at Buckingham Palace. In here is a picture of their wedding. You can see it, and there's Elizabeth and Margaret were in the ceremony, and they're on the balcony with King George and Mary. So there's a lot of pictures in this book which is so hard to come by, and it's the reason why I'm reading it out loud, is because I don't know how to get this book, how people will acquire books like this, because, there's not many of them. And so that's why I'm taking the time to read it, because her story is so fascinating. The task indeed proved more arduous than I thought it would be, but no one could have foreseen the enormous changes that would take place. The extraordinary increase of publicity, the security requirements at Barnwell now have the house and gardens filled with electronic eyes, and a police guard is on 24-hour duty. The variety of roles that the royalty is expected to perform. Before the war, a fair proportion of the official functions of today's royal family was shouldered by local dignitaries. Today, much people have far less time and money, and this support no longer exists. Members of the royal family too have to do much more for themselves than in previous case. I do many things in the way of daily household management that, in my youth, other people, the butlers, the secretaries, the housekeepers, would have done for me. My son and daughter-in-law, who are the present Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, work as hard as we ever did, and incomparably harder than we did before the war. But they cannot afford a chauffeur, a lady's maid, or a valet. We have to share such help as best we can, and for much of his day-to-day business, the Duke dodges about London on a motorbike. This was in the 1980s. Prince Richard on a motorbike, that's quite interesting. The king was greatly pleased with the engagement on the 25th of August, 1935. He wrote to my father from Balmoral. My dear John, I must send you a line to see how delighted the Queen and I that my son Henry is engaged to be married to your third daughter, Alice. When I met you at the Lords the other day, I should have liked to have mentioned the subject, but there were too many people in the room. I trust you have given your consent. Our families have known each other for so many generations now, and that it gives me great pleasure to think that they will be more closely connected still. I've not met your daughter yet, but I hope to do so soon, and I'm sure I will find her charming. She will certainly receive a warm welcome from my family. I suppose, if you approve, the official announcement ought to be made soon, but I want to see my son first. I hope that happens this week. I am so sorry to hear about your operation, and I trust you are feeling better now and more comfortable and will soon be able to go to Bow Hill and get out of the heat of London, which you must be finding very trying. There are a few grouse here, but not very many. With kind messages to the Duchess, believe me, your sincere a friend, Gri, George Regnant. My mother and I were soon invited to Balmoral, I having borrowed some suitable clothes from Angela. On the very first morning I found myself sitting next to the king at breakfast. "What are you doing today?" he asked. "I'm going stalking," I replied, thinking that I had been asked to stay with my fiancé. It would naturally be assumed that I would do whatever he was doing. I did not mean that I intended to shoot myself, just that I would go with him. I could see the remark was not a great success, and we exchanged no further conversation, and off I went stalking with Prince Henry. I was a very good walker, so it was no effort to follow him. When I told him about the effect my announcement had on his father, he laughed. I could not, it seemed. I could not have made a worse faux pas. Ladies at Balmoral at the time were not even allowed to watch the grouse shooting. So the idea that I was intending to go out stalking was completely beyond the pale. It later transpired that the king had been so surprised he had not dared to say anything. Well, we'll just pause it a minute. But Queen Elizabeth, times have changed because Queen Elizabeth did a lot of stalking, deer hunting, and all of that. So the court was much more formal in those days. One was expected to change for tea and again for dinner, when one would wear gloves and jewelry. Today, only the most splendid state occasion call for tiaras. At the time, they were worn relatively often. Such house parties as there were not to the taste of the princess, as the king and queen invited very few guests, and those who did come consisted of older people such as Sister Agnes and Miss Kaiser, who was a particular favorite of the king and had started a hospital for officers in World War One. The princes also very much in awe of their father. He was very fond of them, and they were devoted to him, but he used to bark now and then, and nothing they did ever seemed quite good enough. Not surprisingly, the princes were always happiest staying away from such places as Dunlamrig. Back in London, I spent a good deal of time at Buckingham Palace so that the king could get to know me better. He was very ill then, but apparently I amused him. During dinner, he was inclined to go to sleep. As my stories used to make him laugh, I was always placed next to him. He was kindly and rather absent-minded, not making much effort at conversations. Queen Mary, having been such a close friend of both my grandmothers, was especially pleased with the engagement. She was glad to have another daughter. The Princess Royal being so far away in Yorkshire, and the Duchess of York, now the Queen Mother, was so busy. The Duchess of York and the future King George VI were always an immense support. I and my sisters had always been asked to the famous garden parties over the years. We got very little pleasure out of them, but it would not have been at all the thing for us not to attend. To get round this problem, we used to go in the gate nearest to the Grosvenor's place. We handed over our invitation cards and walked straight out again by the first gate down the wall. Next, we had to choose a date for the wedding. On November the 6th, it was selected, and the church, Westminster Abbey. My father appeared to be a little better, and they allowed him to move north to Bow Hill. But in mid-October, a message came that he had not much longer to live. The Prince of Wales was very thoughtful and lent me his airplane, and I flew up immediately with Mida. Father was already unconscious, but the doctor asked if I would sit by the bed for a while and try to make him talk. He did seem to make a slight effort. The next day, on the 19th of October, he died. He had cancer and had fought fought manfully against it, because he knew that if he lived for a certain period, the family would not have to pay such a large sum of death duties. In, in this final endeavor, he failed, and the full amount had to be delivered. There was great consternation at his death, and much talk at the wedding being postponed. But since the king seemed no less likely to die, it was decided to go ahead, and it was in the private chapel at Buckingham Palace rather than the public splendor of the abbey. This suited the king very well, and I was only too glad not to have a grand wedding. Immediate members of the family and close friends were only guests, to the disappointment of members of the diplomatic corps and many hundreds of others. It was a misty and drizzly day. A coach came to Grosvenor Palace, and Walter drove with me to give me away. Press representation was nothing compared to what it would be today, and we were not accompanied by a single detective, but the crowds were enormous, and it was rather frightening the first time one realized one was the center of attention. However, one knew one had to go through it with it, and that was that. Today, perhaps there's more reason to be fearful, but it does not prey on my mind at all. I am hardened. I have been through too many things in my life. In the face of a crowd, you are helpless, so it's no use bothering. I suppose one should be thankful people remain so interested. The chapel at Buckingham Palace was bombed in the war and no longer exists, but it stood on the site of what is now the Queen's Gallery. I've been to that Queen's Gallery shop near Buckingham Palace. After the ceremony, the wedding breakfast went off happily, except that we could not get the sword to cut the cake because the icing was so stiff. This visibly irritated the king. When we came on the balcony, the mall was so thick with people for as far as one could see, and thousands more cheered us all the way as we traveled in the open coach to St. Pancras. The Duke of Kent's recent foreign honeymoon had been considered too extravagant, so we were told to spend ours quietly in England. We could not think where to go, but finally we settled on Boughton, which was not lived in at that time of the year. There we did some hunting, much to Queen Mary's disapproval. She always considered it a highly undesirable sport. But traveling to North Ireland to stay with the Prockboroughs for some woodcock shooting, 3 days after the wedding, I received the following letter from my new father-in-law. Dear Alice, one line to thank you for your charming letter and to say how touched I was by your kind words, especially those about finding a new father to take the place of one that you have lost. I should love to try and take this place. I shall always do everything to try and help you. Nice to think that you and Harry have a little quiet and rest after the strenuous days you've been living. But I fear your weather has been very bad. Here it has rained every day since you left. We go down to Sandringham on Monday, but I hope it will have improved and we shall be able to have a few days of shooting. Wishing you every possible happiness. Ever your devoted father-in-law, George Regent. I began to write letters to the 1,200 or so people and organizations who'd been so kind enough to give us presents. We received so many lovely things, silver and splendid jewelry from the king and queen, the various wedding cakes, a white ostrich feather wrapped from the ostrich farmers of South Africa, and a standard cart which we felt we had to return to the donor. There were, of course, more modest but equally well-received gifts, like a single lace handkerchief and a pair of blue bedroom slippers. We were to receive a lot of presents in the years to come. many of them rather useless things like elephant tusks, which we hid away till the donor called and then finished out again so as not to give offense. The most lavish presentations were probably those made by shipping companies when one launched one of their ships. They seem to have a tradition of always giving a piece of jewelry. After the honeymoon, we returned to the regiment at York. It turned out to be lucky that we did have the wedding when we did, because only 3 weeks later the court was plunged into mourning by the death of Queen Maud of Norway, the king's sister. And as we were about to emerge from this observance, the king himself died, with the unhappiness and confusion of the abdication to follow. In fact, if our marriage had been postponed, it would have proved extremely difficult for us to contrive of another date. A brother officer lent us his house as a hunting headquarters, which meant by the time we arrived at Sandringham for Christmas, Prince Henry had broke his collarbone. There was an incident at tea one day that I've always remembered in those days. Prince Henry went everywhere with two little black Scottish terriers. They were not popular at Sandringham because the king's dogs did not like other dogs, so they had to be rather hidden away. One day, however, they somehow managed to appear at tea. Knowing this would upset the king, we hurriedly hid them under the table and told them to sit. When they did, until the moment Prince Margaret appeared. She was only 3 or 4 at the time and began to run around and around the table, whereupon one of the Scotties jumped out and bit her on the leg. Prince Henry managed to grab the dog and shove him back under the table before King George noticed, and Prince Margaret, always knowing that the dogs were not meant to be there, went very red in the face but never said a word, which was very noble of her. She disappeared to have her leg doctored in the nursery and soon returned none the worse for fear. It was a rather sad Christmas, with the king ill and the Duke of Windsor away skiing in St. Anton with Mrs. Simpson. This was another reason why Prince Henry and I were discouraged from going abroad, because we also had the idea of going skiing, and there could have been an embarrassing meeting. But the chief anxiety was of the king's health. After Christmas, we returned to York, and from there to London, where we had rooms at Buckingham Palace. Prince Henry was in bed with a very bad go of influenza when his father's health worsened, so he could not go to Sandringham. But I went, and was there when the king died. I came back with Queen Mary. On the drive through London from the station, it was touching to see how people took off their hats and bowed for her as we passed. She was very upset, but controlled, as she always was. I had received a final letter from the king on the 14th of January. Dear Alice, many thanks for your letter. What you say about the servants, especially the butler, is very funny. I'm glad they are not yours. I hope you will find the pavilion at Aldershot warm enough. After very wet and stormy weather, we have got a nice bright frosty days, 11 degrees of frost, and they had been out shooting every day. Unfortunately, I don't yet feel fit enough to shoot, and there is so much to shoot. Last week, in 5 days, 5,000 head. We've had various house guests who come and go. The Gathmore Hardings are here now. Much to our regret, George and Marina and their sweet baby left this morning. Elizabeth is progressing, but very slowly, and it may be some days before she can come here, as she is still so weak. Mary, we expect next week for a few days. The paper is still edged in black. the envelope sealed with black wax, "In mourning for Queen Maud." It was written 6 days before the king himself was to die. The pavilion was the Royal Pavilion at Aldershot, which was to be our home during Prince Henry's time at Staff College. Royal Pavilion was a large wooden bungalow built for Queen Victoria to stay in whenever she came down for her military reviews. The house was raised about a foot above the ground on wooden piles. If you lay down, you could see right underneath. Once one of our heavier guests plunked himself down in a chair, and one of the legs went straight through the floor. There was an enormous dining room and drawing room, a nice small sitting room, main bedroom, a bathroom, dressing room, guest rooms in one of the wings. Staff quarters and kitchen were down the hill and connected to the house by lift and passage. The food was sent up by this means and carried into the dining room, where it arrived none too hot. There were several regiments at Aldershot, guard regiments, cavalry regiments, so we had lots of friends. We entertained and we were entertained, and there was good stables where Prince Henry kept his horses and polo ponies. We used to ride in the evenings when he got home, and we also tried to improve the gardens by cutting back the rhododendrons. I knew many of the officers through my brothers, and so life was one I found reassuringly familiar. I really had nothing much to do. A comptroller looked after the finances, the equerries organized our daily life. I only had to order the meals. In many ways, my life was not much more different to the one I had led before. We hunted with local drag hounds. I watched Prince Henry playing polo. And for Easter, we stayed with friends of ours in Sutherland, the painters, where the Duke enjoyed fishing, the Hemsdale for salmon. I was not so keen, having had more than enough of the sport as a girl. Being at home so much, I'd always been one sent out at the last minute to get salmon for the pot. The change in my status did not worry me particularly. I found everyone bowing and curtsying rather embarrassing at first, but naturally I did not expect old friends in private to do such things or call me ma'am. Our official duties were negligible compared to what they were to become. Oh, this is important. Alice is talking about how she was given no advice by anyone. I thought Prince Henry would tell me what to do, but if anything, it was the other way around. He was very vague, sort of a person who hated any kind of fuss or bother, but was most particular in regard to correctness or dress or uniform at an official occasion. He hated pomposity and liked nothing better than the army and outdoor life. At Staff College, it seemed he was destined for the command of his regiment, the 10th Hussars, and this was always his dearest hope. When he had homework, I helped him color the maps. This did not escape the notice of his teachers. At the end of the course, my handiwork was especially commended by the marks giver. Some of our most enjoyable visits at the time were to Welbeck, the home of the Duke and Duchess of Portland. One of their sons, Mountbatten-Windsor, was a great friend of Prince Henry's. He also was very vague, but an outstanding musician. When on the railway journeys, he used to perch a board on his knee and pretend it was a keyboard. To the astonishment of the carriage, he would then practice imaginary scales. One of his rare public performances was in the depths of winter at some charity concert. He always tended to have cold hands, so he secreted a little hand warmer in his trouser pockets, filled with hot water. In his anxiety, he had not quite fixed the stopper, so, to his horror, while he was playing, he suddenly heard an awful drip on the floor and felt one of his legs slowly becoming waterlogged. An annual and very unpopular event was the Aldershot Tattoo. This was a spectacular military performance which took place in a large arena quite close to the royal pavilion. What with rehearsals and several performers, we used to have to endure many noisy evenings, but the tattoo gave us a welcome excuse to invite friends to dine before attending the performance, either in the grandstand or occasionally wandering undetected behind the scenes, watching the preparations and listening to the remarks of the performers, which were not always too polite. On one occasion, my husband had been asked to open the proceedings. The late Duke of Kent, when walking around the back, thought it would be fun to cut off the electric light cables just as his brother got up to speak. Luckily, he had second thoughts and refrained from doing so. Edward VIII was often quite close by at Fort Belvedere with Mrs. Simpson, and they sometimes invited us over to dinner. This was awkward, as we were unhappy with the liaison as the rest of the family. But as a brother, Prince Henry felt obliged to go. Mrs. Simpson was always charming and friendly, and being American, was always a wonderful hostess. After dinner, we would play vignette gun or rummy or watch a film. It was very informal, and they were the most loving together. I happened to be staying with Queen Mary when the matter finally came to head. The king suddenly appeared after dinner. There were just the queen, the Princess Royale, and myself there at the time. He was in a great state of agitation, and he asked his mother if I could leave the room, as he had a very serious family matter to discuss. Queen Mary was discernibly angered by this request, but with many apologies, she asked me to go, which of course I did. Afterwards, the two of them came to fetch me. They were very upset. And the Queen apologized again. She said, "I'm so sorry. It was so rude of us sending you away. But David has told us some distressing news, which you will know all about in due course. It was not difficult to guess what it might be." Okay, this is the defining moment for Prince Henry. This, he was the next oldest brother after Bertie. So he had intended to spend his time in the military, and he was quiet, very low key, it sounds like, and shy, as was Bertie, and he had to the abdication changed his life tremendously. With David stepping down, it meant Bertie had to become the king, and then with Prince Henry as the next eldest brother, he had to step up and help support his brother. So I'll continue reading, and this is, it changed his life as well. We know it changed King George and Elizabeth and Margaret and the Queen Mother's life, but it changed his life as well. The abdication promoted Prince Henry to the position of regent designate, and much to his disappointment, effectively, it put an end to any further pursuit of his professional career as a soldier. Nevertheless, we stayed on through much of 1937 at the Royal Pavilion. While arrangements were made for us to move into York House, the Duke of Windsor's home before he became king, Queen Mary, as well is known, was keen on visiting interesting houses, and since she was quite close by in London or at Windsor, she would sometimes ask me to go with her. I much enjoyed these expeditions. Another visitor in the royal pavilion was the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. He had recently arrived as an exile in England and been given a house and bath. For political reasons, the king did not want to offend Mussolini, the recent conqueror of Ethiopia, but he felt sorry and sympathy for the emperor and asked Prince Henry to pay his respects on his behalf. Prince Henry, seeing one of the princes and remembering him from his visit to the imperial coronation some years before, said, "How your little son has grown." This was interpreted and meant with the answer, "It's a habit little boys have." Whereupon conversations more or less ceased. However, this did not prevent the emperor coming to us in due course for lunch at Aldershot. Everything went well till a small cream cheese was offered as the conclusion of the meal. Haile Selassie, having no experience of such food, helped himself to the lot. He then waited to observe how it should be eaten, but since there was no more to be had, this proved impossible. In the end, we had an embarrassing task of telling him that since cream cheese was such a rich dish, only a small portion was usually taken by each person. Having a Grace and Favor residence in London at York House, we decided it's time to invest in a home of our own in the country. In 1938, we bought Barnwell Manor in North Hampshire. Barnwell was a 16th century house. It was built near the remains of a Saxon castle, now containing a tennis court, and had in fact been part of the Boughton estate till my father sold it for some mysterious reason in 1912. It was bought by a Polish family and then later on by a rich couple called Captain and Mrs. Cooper. They had amused themselves designing a Tudor room, a Chinese room, and so on, each one more garish and unsuitable than the next. Eventually, Captain Cooper went off to Kenya and on a safari, where he woke one night with an excruciating tummy ache. His lady friend said, "Castor oil is the answer to everything. Take a swig of this." But unfortunately, the poor man had a burst appendix, so that was the end of him, and for his wife, the end of Barnwell. Back then, castor oil was an answer to everything. I remember my dad saying him having to take a swig of castor oil. It was like to prevent illnesses, but he said it was just awful. It was such an awful thing to swallow down. In spite of the Coopers' bad taste, we liked the house immediately and its geographical position. It was near Boughton, in easy reach of several of the best English hunts, and close by several friends with shooting estates, including my then brother-in-law, David Burgley. It could have hardly been more suited to our needs. We bought the building and 4 tenanted farms for £37,000, the large part of the money left to Prince Henry by his father. Undoing the Coopers' decorations was an expensive, and because of this outbreak of the war, drawn-out business, but it proved well worth it. When we went to Australia in 1945, we sold the tenant part of the estate for £47,000. And over the years since our return, we've succeeded in buying up land around about to the equivalent of pre-war extent of 5,000 acres. Perhaps the happiness Barnwell brought is best conveyed by the length of time some of our original staff stayed with us, most notably Mr. Amos, who only retired to Kent in 1979, and Mr. Prater, who traveled the world with us no less tirelessly as a chauffeur, though as now retired, is still on hand to help when needed. In 1937, it was a busy year, with the coronation and a consequent increase in our official duties. I was made commander of the St. John's Ambulance Association and Brigade and received the Freedom of Edinburgh and accepted my first patronages. One of these was an organization called Invalid Kitchens, which was started by my godmother, Lady Carmichael. It involved kind ladies running a voluntary food service for elderly invalids, the forerunner of Meals on Wheels. There were only 3 of these kitchens in the whole of London at the time. I also succeeded the old Duke of Connaught as president of the Royal Academy of Music. The first time I attended their degree ceremony, I found the room insufferably hot and stuffy, and yet there did not seem to be a single window open. I asked if it would be possible to have some air, whereupon there would be a great gasp of relief. Apparently, they were shut only because the Duke had always insisted upon it. When I began, all but a half a dozen of the students were girls. It's as if music was considered to be a rather sissy thing for a boy to do. Now the boys outnumbered the girls. In the autumn of 1938, perhaps a result of this increase in my activities, I suffered a second miscarriage, and the doctor ordered a complete rest. We decided to go to Kenya. Most of the trips was spent on safari. Prince Henry did not mind roughing it a bit, but as he'd always had people to do everything for him, he was used to everything being perfectly arranged by somebody else. When things went awry, he tended to rely on me. Our white hunter was very upset because I refused to use my big game license, which had been given to me as a present that cost £200. He also disliked the fact that I could understand Swahili. If he did not want to do something, he used to tell us, "Oh, there's no water there," or they'd say all the elephants have gone, forgetting I had the better of him through overhearing the true facts from the Africans. "That's not what I understand," I used to say frostily. I couldn't pull the wool over on Alice. She knew Swahili. So. It was the time of Munich, and we were told before we left England that if the war seemed imminent, we would be cabled to return. Through the safari, therefore, we dreaded seeing the dust of an approaching car or motorbike, because in those days, the country was empty. There were no vehicles around, except one on the lookout for us, and it would have been likely to be out in the bush. One day, to our horror, a cloud did approach, and the fatal cable was delivered. But when we arrived back at Deloraine to pack up, we found another cable just arrived, canceling the first. To our joy, we could stay another fortnight. On the way back to England, we stopped off in Paris for one night to see the Windsors. It was Neville Chamberlain's idea, not to ours. The governments were still undecided whether to assign the Duke an official role or not, and before reaching a conclusion, they wanted some guidance in the form of public reaction in England to the news of our visit. The Windsors took us out to dine in some smart restaurant. I did not feel in the least chic, with the red dust of Kenya hardly out of my hair. But the Duke and Duchess were more than kind. But by today's standards, there was virtually no press interest. Nevertheless, some mentions of the meeting did appear in the English papers, and a lot of old ladies duly wrote furiously disapproving letters, which I found was quite upsetting. Nothing we ever did in the years to come was to prove controversial as the exploratory visit to the Windsors, though one is always in receipt of a certain number of cranky letters. The worst of them seemed to come to an end with the finish of the war. though whether there was any connection or not, I shall never know. Certainly begging letters have not increased with inflation or the recent rise in unemployment, nor insulting ones as a result of the troubles in Northern Ireland. People usually write because they've had a request refused or unanswered somewhere else. Sometimes little presents are sent and are always acknowledged and accepted with thanks. The telephone, too, was inevitably increased, and the number of welcome callers, though most of are cut off by my staff. After the war, there was somebody with a Scotch voice forever ringing up. He was kept at bay until summer in Scotland, when the temporary footman led him to speak to me under the mistaken impression that it was my brother Billy. I was trapped. Oh, said the caller, got you at last, but then embarked on a long tale of woe about how he had been a merchant seaman who fought throughout the war but never received his service medal. Oh dear, how very unfortunate, I said, as sympathetically as possible. I'm sorry, but I suppose there must have been a certain number of people in the war who did things, and it's difficult to remember everybody. I'm sure we're all terribly grateful to you for the brave things you did. Thank you, he replied. Now I shall have peace of mind because I know a member of the royal family knows about me. And he never rang again. If only I had spoken to him at that outset, what a lot of trouble we should all have been spared. The press can be equally persistent, and they succeeded in getting through to me. I do not put on a funny voice. I just say I'm somebody else. It is useless to try to be clever. And that's the end of chapter 9.